Okay, 15 years ago, I arrived firstly in Berlin, and a German friend of mine took me to the east, to Prenzlauer Berg area, and it was, let's say, anarchistic viertel then, very, very underground bars that we stayed there. I felt like in a third world, somehow. In the third world. 3 months ago, I think, I visit again this area. It's very, very, it's gentrificated area, a very sophisticated one. And the common language was a mix of German, English, and Hebrew. So once we started to build the program, we understood that we have to deal with the new diaspora in Germany in whole, but in Berlin in particular. And I looked for someone that will represent the Israelis in Berlin, and it was very like the Zentralrat that didn't want to come here. Also, Ilan Weiss, that represent, I think, Israelis in Berlin, through his website, Israelis in Berlin, said, yes, I will come, and then he had a cold feet and decided not to come. And then I didn't know what to do, and I read an article in the paper, written or interviewed a lady called Elinor Levy about a new film, a new movie that is going to the screens shortly, called Aliya LeBerlin. And Aliya LeBerlin is so provocative. Aliyah is to Israel and not to anywhere else. So it was a Google mission to find her mail, and I found it, and I wrote her a mail, and she said, yes, we'll come, and not me, the producer. So Mr. Zachary Johnston is with us. He's the director, he's the screenwriter, I think, the script writer. And he will represent the movie Aliya LeBerlin, and inside look at a new diaspora, including movie footages. It will take us, we'll do it in 2 steps. And Zach is a director, writer, producer, raised in Washington State. Zachary Johnston has been working in independent filmmaking in Berlin since 2008. In between, he has traveled extensively throughout Europe, Africa, and in Asia, taught English language in Czech Republic, Russia, and Indonesia, and has sailed several high seas. Okay. So he's a sailor too, maybe. Zach has produced, written, and directed commercials, shorts, music videos, and documentaries. I don't know what is shorts. I know what my shorts are. So very short movies. He's graduated from American University with BA degrees in political science and history, and holds a postgraduate certificate in screenwriting from New York Film Academy. He lives in Berlin with his wife Anna and and their sons. And I go out because when you start talking and then
always good being a second choice. I'll start by saying thank you to the Kantor Center, to Dr. Haim Fireberg and the university for this wonderful invitation to speak here. Truly inspired by the passion and the knowledge present at this gathering. Okay, is that better? Okay. Let me first apologize for my Berliner attire. Berliner artists, so we're poor but sexy, and as you can see, we're poor but not starving. I have to admit I feel a little out of my depth being amongst so many professors and doctors and professionals, and I'm just a mere director. I'm used to speaking at film festivals and talking about my movies, so I'm going to sort of approach this in that respect, if that's okay. This whole thing sort of started with my mother and her family. Her parents were Berliners. They lived through the terror of the Nazi regime. They somehow survived the Battle of Berlin as teenagers, and after the end of the war in the 1950s, they decided that Germany was no longer a place for them, and they emigrated first to Canada, then to the United States. However, my mother always reveled in her German heritage, and my grandmother probably never left all of Germany behind. It always carried it with her. My grandfather, on the other hand, bought a pair of cowboy boots and a cowboy hat upon arriving in North America and pursued the American dream, his manifest destiny. My mother, though, we always made monthly pilgrimages to a German deli and had Schrimpen and Marzipantorte, and so Germany was always part of me when I was growing up. When I was moving to Berlin, I told my grandparents I was moving back, and my grandmother was elated. My grandfather was a bit incredulous. He said he wouldn't move back to Berlin for $1 million. Well, I went anyway, but unfortunately nobody offered me $1 million to go. Berlin's the sort of city where on the surface one's identity can seem anonymous. But I believe that means your identity becomes a lot more important to who you are. You cherish it. When I first arrived in Berlin, I noticed a small but growing prominent Israeli population. This was 5 or 6 years ago. As a storyteller, this intrigued me. Of all the places I had previously lived, Israelis were not prominent immigrants. But not so in Berlin, and it seemed counterintuitive to me personally that Israelis would choose Berlin, steeped in history everyone in this room knows inside and out, to call a new home or a temporary home even. So I investigated. But at the time, the Israeli community was fledgling at best. The infancy of social media had not offered the opportunity for a platform. There were no Israeli nights and clubs, no artist organizations. There, of course, were a handful of Jewish restaurants and cafes, but they were there before with the Jewish population that was in Germany. I realized my investigations were premature and my thoughts and work turned elsewhere. Years passed and the Israeli community grew, and it started to grow very quickly. Suddenly there were Facebook groups, web pages, Israeli club nights, hummus cafes in Prenzlauer Berg. The Star of David became a familiar sight on posters. And I knew it was now or never for my film. The populations of Israelis surpassed the Americans, the British, and the Australians last year. Some put the numbers at 15,000, others say it's closer to 20,000. Whatever the number, the Israeli impact on the city is clear and prominent today. So I started to investigate again, and with any speculative film, I went through several permutations. I looked into the German Jewish community that stayed in Berlin after the dark times of the Second World War. I interviewed former Soviet Jews who came in the 90s after the wall came down. Then I realized I could never tell all their stories with fairness and justice in just 90 minutes. Oh, sorry. Slow. Oh, I'm sorry. No problem. I'll gladly oblige. So yeah, I looked into the German Jewish community of people who had stayed after the war and the Holocaust, and I also interviewed several former Soviet Jews who had moved to Berlin after the fall of the wall, and I found that I was trying to do too much, and so I streamlined my movie to just focus on Israelis in Berlin, because it wouldn't be fair to the other groups to just touch on their issues and not really truly explore and give them the time they deserve in a 90-minute film. And the most prominent thing that came from my research was identity. And the identity of Israelis in Berlin was unique. A lot of us who are immigrants to Berlin, Americans, British, Irish, what have you, we sort of leave our identity in our flats. We don't wear our identity out when we go to clubs or restaurants. And so that in and of itself was unique to Israelis in Berlin, I found. And this is also a very personal topic for me, as identity is something I've struggled with all my life. My mother, like I said, was an immigrant to America's shores, but my father was an American Indian, and I come from a tribe, a very small tribe. As of now, there are 700 of us and shrinking, And to be exact, there are 20 people in my tribe that still have pure-blooded heritage. And they're all over 60, and they're all probably going. It's called the Skokomish tribe. It's in western Washington on the Hook now. And so once those 20 people are gone, you can argue whether or not our people are gone. 10 years ago, the U.S. government officially deemed our language extinct. And so resignation is unfortunately found in the bottom of an alcohol bottle for most. But then again, it's been pretty dire for the last century. Also, I grew up with a father as a Native American in the 60s and 70s. He called the United States a police state. As a child, I didn't really understand that. As a teenager, I found my Indian heritage, grew my hair long, and suddenly I was being stopped on the streets by cops, asking me where I was going, what I was doing, making sure I wasn't bothering anybody, and to stay off private property. And so I cut my hair, and those problems stopped. Around the same time, my mother's germanophilia prompted her to research her family lineage. She struck gold when she found her grandfather's party papers for entering the Nazi Party, as every member had to fill out an application that proved their Aryan lineage. However, we found that a branch was missing. A mother was missing from one of the dockets about 100 years earlier. And we researched more and more, and we found a dead end at the end with that person at the end of the 18th century. And finally, we discovered that that woman's last name was Hoffman, and she wasn't in any of the Lutheran books. She was actually in a synagogue book. And he simply deleted her to cover up that bit of their heritage. And so we found a Jewish nth great-grandmother to me. And for whatever reason, they assimilated between the 1790s and 1810 and became Germans. Why, I really cannot say. But I do know that conversion most likely saved my grandmother and her parents' lives in World War II, but it cost them their souls, in my opinion. And this is where our movie is. A decision changes you. If you move somewhere else, if you change who you are, that has an impact on future generations that you can't even begin to fathom. For instance, that woman who married a Lutheran man, gave up her Judaism, meant that my grandmother was probably not sent to a liquidation camp, and instead her father was a Nazi. And to me that was profound, and that identity is something that you never know where it's going to lead you. And so I tackled my documentary from this point of view. I assembled a team of producers and we went to work. In the early days when I was talking to Berliner friends, German friends about the project, they often scoffed, as Berliners do, because they like snark above all else. And they would always ask, well, what are you going to do next? Are you going to make a film about the Spanish immigrants and the Turkish immigrants and the Irish immigrants? And I said, well, no, that's not as interesting because your parents and grandparents didn't try to exterminate the Spanish or the Turkish or the Irish. And that got their attention, and it also shut them up, I might add. Time passed, research piled up, and identity remained a central theme. For me, there is a clear Jewish identity that is part of Israel. A group of people strove to make a new nation, language, life in the desert that comes with a strong commitment of building that identity. Seeing this identity come along to Berlin is fascinating, to say the least. It is not uncommon to see Israeli flags and iconography in Berlin now. It's blatant. I, for one, find this fascinating, as I would never brazenly put an American flag up in my flat, or I probably would never even go to a bar that had an American flag up. But my American identity isn't central to who I am. It's not a matter of pride with me. I didn't help build America. I lived my life in the fodder of manifest destiny, and the other half of my life relishing the destiny that my grandfather found. And so I really wanted to explore what it was that made Israelis want to bring Israel with them to Berlin and not just leave it here, because it is absolutely unique. The interviews started. Certain groups within the groups came into focus. There are, of course, multitude of variables of why Israelis moved to Berlin. The three main groups we seem to have found overall, and excuse the broad brushstroke, there's a group of Israelis who simply love the city and move there and want to live there. There's no ulterior motive. They maintain their Israeli identity, and in some cases, their Israeliness even grows while they're in Berlin. Their life is almost apolitical and as simple as that. There are, of course, a huge artist scene in Berlin because, let's face it, Berlin is where you have to be if you want to be an artist in the 21st century. And then there are the dissidents, a group of Israelis that sort of moved to Berlin as a snub to the Israeli system and government. It's their form of political protest to move to a city so steeped in negative history for Judaism and Israelis. They, for whatever reason, have had enough of the mechanisms of Israel and get out. So they scream their disillusionment from the rooftops. Some simply blog and hide away in their techless apartments. Some even burn their Israeli passports as a sign of protest. They call themselves political refugees, though I'm not sure I would call them that. And the point of our film is not to solve Israel's regional disputes or give a bully pulpit to those who scream murder but offer no solution to make a veritable change in policy, except, of course, their escapism to Berlin. Our film is about what it means to be an Israeli and live in Berlin permanently, to raise children in German institutions and schools, to use German in day-to-day life, to live with a dark, tragic history on every street corner. We are asking how you walk over a Stolpersteine every day. How do you teach your children what those little bronze cobbles means? How do you tell them, yes, this child was 3 years old when they were murdered in Auschwitz. What does that do to their psyche? What are you sacrificing to live in a place with something like that on every single street? For me, like Dr. Fireberg mentioned, I have 2 small children. One has just started school, and he's struggling with, does he speak German at home? Does he only speak German at school, et cetera, and it's not easy. And I don't come along with the baggage from America that an Israeli does. I just simply don't. And as an American, if I want to, I can ignore the history because it's not part of my heritage. I choose not to ignore the history, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be here, but you know what I'm saying. So in our film, we are following a family who's right now in the process of moving from Israel to Berlin. And we're exploring what it means to their personal family here in Israel, their reactions, what it means to their community, and what it's going to mean when they move there, how they're going to integrate, the problems they're going to have, the ease they're going to have, what community are they going to fall into, how quickly are they going to seek out an Israeli community to feel that sense of home, how often they come back. We're also in the process of filming a former survivor of the camps who was on one of the founding boats to Israel, and he's retiring and wants to move back to Berlin where he was born and spend his twilight years. That sort of cathartic experience works perfectly in film, so I'm very happy that he's agreed. But I think it's also interesting that, he never, even though what the German government did to him in the 40s, he never left Berlin and wants to spend his last years there. And I think it means a lot to identity that, like the previous speaker said, we have multiple identities. It's not just one. He's not a Berliner. He's not just Israeli. He's not just a Jew. He's all of those things. Just like I'm not just an Indian. I'm not just a German immigrant. I'm not just an American. I'm not just a Berliner. I'm all of those things. For today, I have assembled 2 special interviews for you. I figured it'd be best if I let an Israeli speak for themselves who live in Berlin as opposed to me prattle on endlessly up here. But I believe they represent a moment in life of an Israeli in Berlin today. This is not fiction. This is not entertainment. These are testimonies. And if we preserve these testimonies today, tomorrow greater minds than mine will be able to interpret and look back at these for historical reference. Maybe some of the minds in this room, maybe the next generation of great thinkers will be able to look at these moments, these people, and know what it was like to be an Israeli and be a Jew in Berlin in 2013. No matter what the future holds, because, none of us know. First, we'll hear from a young man. His name is Tomer Dotan. He teaches Hebrew to children of half Israeli, half German families. He also blogs political commentary about Israeli politics. And the reason we chose him is he's a positive force. His criticism doesn't come from a flippant or snarky place. It comes from a genuine desire for the best for his country, Israel. The next person you will hear from is Narit Beiler. She's been in Berlin for several years, and she co-founded an institution called Habait. And Habait is very interesting to me because it's a gathering place primarily for Israeli artists. And they offer, a little bit of home, they have hummus nights and they have meetups and things like that. They offer Israelis better exposure in the Berlin art scene and recognition as Israeli artists. And they also host a lot of parties and gatherings. Like, for instance, they had a kibbutz party just last month at an old factory near Wedding, and the wine and hummus flowed and fueled traditional dances all night. It was quite lovely. So, in closing, I would like to say that, surprisingly, I learned many things about Israel by being in Berlin, and I learned many things about Judaism by being in Berlin. And everyone always asks, why Berlin, and it's been said many times on this dais during the last few days. And I really have to say, why not? It's inexpensive, it's a haven for artists, it's libertine, there's a decent social structure in place, it's multilingual, so on and so forth. The list continues. It's the perfect place to have a break from home. It's a perfect place to start a new home. And I noticed the Israeli population is largely fairly young in Berlin. And as with all youth, naivety is a cornerstone of one's persona. And perhaps Berlin offers a place to overcome that naivety, to rage against the machine a little bit, to relish in the liberty and to snub authority, which makes these young Israelis in Berlin just like the rest of the youth out there, looking to make sense of a world they're not quite sure of yet. I'd like to say being at this conference has been very enlightening. Speaking with some of you, sharing ideas is a cornerstone of every good film. I can't say where Judaism is going in Germany, but in Berlin, it seems to be growing and it seems to be flourishing right now. And there's no place on earth a story like this can take place without a few bumps in the road. But if we capture this moment, freeze it in celluloid amber for future generations, then we have the history. And we can at least know there was a bright moment in German history and the Berliner history with Judaism and Israelis. So I'd like to say, if you want to find out more about the film, we have a website, aliyaleberlin.com. You can find us on Facebook, of course, as well. I just want to say thank you again. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I will queue up the interviews.
I teach Hebrew for a living, for a bit of living, kids that are half Israeli and half not. And I write a blog of just about my thoughts on being Israeli in Berlin. I think it's really interesting to be an Israeli in Berlin. It raises a lot of questions about what is being Israeli and what is being in Berlin. I mean, both things have a lot of meanings. I mean, is it just a geographical definition or a cultural, or what does it mean? And to hear German on the street, to study in German, to study philosophy in German, to study philosophers that are, for example, very identified with a certain agenda, like Martin Heidegger and so on. And I find it very interesting here. Well, I think Hebrew, I consider Hebrew more of a Jewish thing than an Israeli thing, in a way.
How so?
How so? Because it existed way before Israel. And because its origins comes from Jewish texts and from Jewish philosophy and from all these things, and it was not spoken for so many years because it was the holy language to Jews. So I think it has a much of a bigger history with Judaism than with the state of Israel. Obviously, naturally, today is the official language of Israel, but I think it's not really something that could be identified with being Israeli speaking Hebrew. It's more being Jewish, speaking Hebrew. Or I think a lot of things that we do we're not aware of the fact that they're influenced by a lot of other things that happened in our personal history, for example, in our experiences in Israel, or in, of course, our people's history here in Germany or before, and so on. For example, to tell your mom that you have a German girlfriend or stuff like that. That's the point where you start thinking about it, because until that point you just go ahead, and then you hear the reaction and you're like, okay, maybe there is something to it. Maybe this relationship is on other levels as well, on levels of acceptance or with the past, and it's I'm just giving this example because it's the most intimate example that there is. Well, it wasn't very easy. 3 of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, which I would like to say Holocaust refugees because of all this context. So it wasn't very easy. I'm kind of lucky, I think, that all of these 3 are not alive today to hear it, because I have no idea how would they react to the fact that I'm here. So it was not easy, but it was also not that hard, because my grandparents have passed away, and
so your immediate family, your parents were supportive? Or?
At the beginning, no, but within time, I think there was. I don't think I know. There was a little hope at the beginning that I would regret it and come back. And after a few months, once they realized it's not going to happen anytime soon, so they started supporting it, because if you can't beat them, join them. Well, we are something different here. We're not part of the Jewish community, because most Israelis that move here are secular or even atheists, although it's not very common to say that you're an atheist but don't believe in God. So we don't get the support from the Jewish community. We don't get the support from the German government, those who don't have the German passport. And so we have, by this power, we kind of must find each other and help if help is needed. Again, there's Israelis that come here and they don't need any help. They can just go on and live their lives here like they never just immigrated. Yeah, it's very clear. Well, I'm just trying to say nothing that could sound anti-Semitic.
You're allowed to say whatever you want to me.
Yeah, I know, but I would have to take the responsibility afterwards. So, okay.
Well, do you think that's like one of the things that draws Israelis here, is that there is that definition?
I'll tell you what. I think I'll go a bit backwards in this discussion now. I think I said at the beginning that there is the atmosphere in Israel that everyone are victimized. I think that's a Jewish thing. I think, today it's kind of known that without the Holocaust there would be no state of Israel, because after the Holocaust the necessity of a Jewish state was clear to the whole world. But there's another reason, to my opinion. I think another reason is that without being victimized as we were in the Holocaust, we would have to gather around something else. We would have to unite around something else, like Jewish philosophers, writers, politicians, scientists that are the amazing Jewish Renaissance of the 18th, 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And these people that we would have to unite around, they would have never allowed stuff that Israel is doing today. So we have to be victimized in a way. We have to unite around this feeling of being a victim, and the people that are sick of it finding themselves in Berlin.
Do you identify yourself as Jewish, Israeli, both, neither?
Well, first human.
Right.
Afterwards, I would say Jewish. I think it's a very interesting detail. Then, of course, Israeli. I think it's also important. I mean, with my opinions and with what I write and publish sometimes, I get a lot to hear that I'm Israeli hater, or that I'm anti-Zionist, or whatever curse there is in the Israeli lexicon. But I think it's exactly the opposite. It's that I care, and that's why I think this treatment is needed. Well, the negative thing is that sometimes, it is a big city, and there's a lot of different people here and different nationalities, and that's what's really beautiful about this city. But it could also sometimes bring up stuff that I just ran away from, in a way. For example, some racist comments that are coming from the Middle East that I used to hear in Israel and were part of this phenomenon that I ran away from, and then suddenly I hear it here, or I see it written here, or whatever. And not just by Israelis, by the way, also by Palestinians, or Syrian, or whatever. And yeah, it's just, well, I think it's a problem to have, it's a problem to make like an Israeli community in Berlin. First of all, you would have to deal with this thing that is called the Israeli identity, that you deal with all the time in Israel, and the most of people don't want to deal with it here.
Yeah, many do.
Many do, yeah. Well, I'm doing it and I'm enjoying it, but for a lot of people it's a headache. And I think, well, for example, if there is some kind of Israeli community, if there was some kind of Israeli community in Berlin, who does it serve? You have Russian Jews that were living in Israel for a few years and then moved away, and they have an Israeli passport. Are they Israelis? Are they not Israelis? You have Palestinians with an Israeli passport. Does an Israeli community take care of these Palestinians here because they have a blue passport? I mean, well, you would have to start asking those questions if you would want to have an Israeli community here. Again, for a lot of people, that's exactly what they don't want, and that's one of the reasons they're here. But I think that's very individual. There's a lot of people that are just being Israelis, and they're not in Berlin, in this sense that they're just hanging out only with Israelis and, searching for Israelis all over. And there are Israelis here that are not Israelis. They are just in Berlin. And they're exactly the opposite, running away from Israelis and don't want to see them. I was once in this situation. I was in a hummus place in Köln, the south of the city, and we were just Israelis in the place. There was maybe 5 tables taken by Israeli people, like here 2 people, here 3, here 4. And they were all talking about each other in a way. And they were all talking about so many Israelis here, that's disgusting. You know, and the place is full with Israelis, and you yourself. So, well, that's also a phenomenon, I guess. I'm trying to balance those two, not to be on this extreme, not to be on the other, because the middle is, in this case, is very interesting. And you have to ask a lot of questions until you start dealing with it. I mean, as I said, you have to ask what is Israeli, and you have to ask what is in Berlin, and then you can start asking what is being Israeli in Berlin.
I think the main reason, even though if it sounds really shallow, it's a cheap place to live in. You live in Europe, you can have a good life here, even if you're a starving artist, and you don't have a full-time job, and if you're a student, and it's an easy place to live in, and you're in the center of Europe, and you're in, I think, the coolest city in Europe today, and it's an international city. It's almost like New York, but it's just close by to Israel. And yeah, in Israel it's harder. For young people it's hard. It's a fact. I mean, unfortunately this is the situation, and Berlin offers many Israelis today a place to do their thing. So then again, Israelis, they're Israelis, okay, they have their past as Jews, but they're also normal people, and they want to be where hip is. They also want to be there, so they're coming here as well. I think this is the basic reason, because Berlin is the place, so Israelis want to be there too. Other things, which I think, I don't know, I'm thinking about it, I mean, from time to time, what made it like it is, and I think, first of all, we have a generation change. I mean, the grandparents' generation is passing away, unfortunately, and maybe Israelis that had the possibility to get a Polish or a German passport will not do it before, when their grandparents were still alive. Now they're not there. People are more pragmatic also. I think also the notion in Israel of an Israeli living abroad is changing slowly. Yeah, I mean, for me, actually, my Israeli identity grew stronger here. That's for sure. And I think I speak for a lot of other Israelis. I mean, you think about things which you didn't think about in Israel. I mean, just this Jewish thing also. You're being asked here by Germans. I hear it very often. When I say I'm from Israel, they very often ask or want to ask, are you Jewish? It's in the air, and I don't know if it's a big deal. And the thing I learned to see, actually, they have their idea what is Jewish, and this is something I don't think you would experience in America, you know, or even in Paris or in London, because Jews are a part of daily life. I mean, there are Jews, there are locals, there are, I don't know, other immigrants. Yeah, you're the voice of Israel in a way. I mean, and you're being intrigued to think about things maybe you didn't think about before, about your Israeli identity, your political direction, your Jewish, I'm not saying religious, but this Jewish tradition. Well, what does it mean for me to be Jewish? Yeah, and something is happening. I mean, there are a lot of now here frameworks done by Israelis to offer kind of Sunday schools for really newborn children, Israelis or half Israeli in Berlin. Yeah, it also depends on the parents, I guess. How important is it for them? And do they speak Hebrew at home? They don't speak Hebrew at home. Yeah, but it's interesting. I think something is happening here. I mean, it's people are moving here. I mean, people are also moving back. I must say, I know quite a few Israelis that have came here and they lived here a few years, either studied here or tried living here. But then after 3 winters with -5 degrees and but then I have my other life, which really my heart is in. It's German-Israeli relations on social level. I mean, I experienced for myself being able to meet young Germans as a teenager had a big impact on myself and the way I see things and the way I also get to know people as people. I mean, and not being maybe so much afraid of I mean, stories which are not necessarily maybe related to them directly and personally. And I started actually with two other young Israelis here, which we were friends since I moved here. We started about 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, a monthly Israeli Stammtisch, like a meeting point for young Israelis. And this is something we started because we noticed back then there were much less Israelis, and every time when there was a gathering of Israelis, it was really a lot of fun for everyone. You can just speak Hebrew, you can just have black humor jokes about Germany, you can eat your like home food and just feel at home. Called Habayit. Habayit is the house, the home in Hebrew. And this idea really came from what's going on here. I mean, from the one side, lots of Israelis, Israeli artists living here, doing arts. Some of them are living here for many years already, and maybe have not been really identified as Israelis. Also Germans that have been living in Israel, or their art is related to Israel. And Israelis were looking also for some kind of cultural life which they relate to, and very, very big interest from the Germans. What is Israeli culture? Is this Jewish culture? Is this klezmer? Is this something else? What is it? And what we started doing, a group of approximately 10 people, Israelis and non-Israelis, but were interested in Israel and were engaged in German-Israeli relations. We thought, okay, we're going to kind of form a platform for Israeli modern art and culture to be performed in Germany, in the German language, and to allow perhaps the general German public to have a glimpse into Israeli culture, to experience it here in Berlin. And what we did is actually, we are still in the process of forming an official say it's Gemeinnützigkeit-Verein, so it's like a kind of cooperation which we're not trying to make money out of it, we're just doing it all in our free time, we're not getting paid for a non-profit organization, exactly. And we are doing, I mean, each of us has their crowds and their network of people in their fields of interests and work. And we just try to really collect all those different groups and bring them together and make, like, coming Thursday a party here, which is going to be a theme party, like a kibbutz party with some 80s, 90s, just like a normal disco, but with a bit of kibbutz folklore or something like that. So, yeah, it's a tough question because I think Israeli culture is a lot about language. But Hebrew is a language which is hard to communicate with non-Hebrew speakers. So I think really Israeli culture is a lot about those discussions and also this kind of really surreal maybe situations to be an Israeli in Berlin. Bit of black humor also. Being here, it's hummus. It's Hebrew music, it's about being open to another, just to feel really without this German officialness, and just being tachlis, I guess. I would say this is Israeli culture.